Hello everyone, welcome to AWS Tutorials. In AWS Tutorials, we provide workshops and exercises to learn about AWS services. These workshops and exercises are published to our website aws-dozo.com. Today we are going to talk about how to use Transient Amazon EMR cluster. And I am making this video on the request of some of the viewers who said, hey, can you talk about how and when to use a Transient Amazon EMR cluster. So let's get started. So just to give you an introduction about EMR, and I'm not going to spend much time here because I already created another video which talks about absolute beginners tutorial for EMR, so you might want to visit that to learn more about how EMR works and how you can do development within EMR. But I just want to quickly capture the purpose of EMR. So many times you have a requirement where you want to process and analyze a very large amount of data, whether you're doing it for machine learning purposes or you want to, for instance, do data engineering and you want to do large amount of data transformation or data aggregation. In that case, you have a requirement to process a very large amount of data. And generally you use big data frameworks, the frameworks which are designed for doing big data processing. Frameworks like your Hadoop or Spark with open source project like Pig or Hive. So if you want to use big data frameworks along with open source project for big data framework, then in that case, such a large amount of data with big data frameworks can be used with EMR cluster. And AWS provides a managed EMR cluster. That means the whole infrastructure part is managed and maintained by AWS. You have to just worry about creating your task on EMR to process the large amount of data. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go in EMR in detail, but just to give you an introduction. So in short, EMR is a managed platform from AWS to process large amount of data using big data frameworks. Okay, fair enough. So what problem we are trying to solve using Transient EMR cluster? So when you have launched an EMR cluster, typically you will find that your EMR cluster is used in two modes. And one mode is a full occupancy situation. So for instance, suppose that your EMR cluster is launched, it is up and running, and then you have some task, some step, some job for the EMR running 24/7. So your EMR cluster is never idle. So you launched it and then you always have some task running on, or some job, some data processing job running on the cluster. So your cluster is running 24/7 and it is utilized 24/7. That's one situation. A very good situation because you are paying for 24/7 and your cluster is in use for 24/7. But there are sometimes other situations where you have partial occupancy, like your cluster is running 24/7, but you don't have jobs to run 24/7. So you run your jobs in periods. So like you run for some time, then there's no run, then you run for some time, then again no run, then you run for some time and then no run, right? So you'll find that if your cluster is running 24/7, these are the times when the jobs are running, actually you are making use of what you're paying for the cluster. When the other periods, when you have no job, no task running on the EMR cluster, you are paying for the cluster, but your cluster is doing nothing for you. So those are the idle times. That means your cluster is running but doing nothing, but still you're paying for it. Okay. And if you come across scenario where you're in the larger part and in a larger part of the cluster runtime, the cluster is idle. The cluster is not doing anything. Yeah, if the large compute hours of the cluster are idle, are doing nothing, then it is a situation for you, because then your cost and your outcome both are not optimized. Okay, and it can happen, guys, because trust me, I mean, you will have jobs which you might want to run once in a day, once in a week, once in a month, once in a year, or twice in a year, twice in a month. I mean, there will be scenarios when you will have jobs which you want to run, but they are not very high demand, high frequency jobs, and in that case, if you launch a EMR cluster, it is not fully utilized. So that's where transient EMR cluster helps. If your cluster is fully utilized, is running 24/7, and you have jobs for 24/7, then you don't need to think about transient EMR cluster. But if you have a EMR cluster which is not fully utilized, and I won't say 100, but I won't say like, yeah, as I say, most of your compute hours are idle, then in that case, you don't want to, then you can probably think of moving to transient EMR cluster, and that can help you optimize your cost and your consumption, or your job time, okay, job consumption. So let's see how exactly it works. So for instance, if you are running a normal EMR cluster, then in that case you simply launch EMR cluster, and then you run your tasks. Sometimes you can run more than one task. Sometimes you run one task or two tasks. And task or job inside EMR cluster are called steps. So sometimes you can run one step or more than one step, but that's how your normal cluster works. But if you have no step, still your EMR cluster is running and you're paying for it, though you're not basically making any use of that time, right? So the way the transient EMR cluster works is that in this case, you launch an EMR cluster, then your task runs, your job runs, your step runs, and then the cluster gets terminated. And this you can do, so like in this case, you saw here that you run an EMR cluster and cluster stays there, cluster lives there. And then you can run your steps, your jobs, as many times you want during the day, even more than once at the same time. But if you're going for a transient mode, then in that case, you launch an EMR cluster, run one or more step at the same time. So let me be very clear, it's not only one step, but one or more steps at the same time after launching the EMR cluster, and then the cluster gets terminated. And this you can do multiple times. So now think of a scenario. So that's how transient EMR cluster works. So if suppose you're running some job once in a day, then once in a day with transient EMR cluster, you launch EMR cluster, you run your job, and the cluster terminates. Twice in a month, same way. Once in a week, same way. 5 times in a year, same way. So basically your EMR cluster runs, completes the job, and terminates. And you pay till the time EMR cluster was running. And when it's terminated, gone, no billing comes to you. So if you have a scenario where you don't have job for 24/7, then in that case, and you're running some kind of periodic job, low frequency jobs, then in that case, it does make sense that you run your EMR cluster in a transient mode, so that you launch the cluster, run the job or number of jobs, and then terminate the cluster. And you just pay for that period of time when your EMR cluster was running. And then for rest, you don't pay. There's nothing on your cluster. Okay? So that's how the EMR cluster works. Now the beautiful part is that your configuration of your transient EMR cluster is no different from your normal cluster. It's the same thing. Only difference is that in the transient, in the normal cluster, you don't need to know steps upfront. You simply can launch an EMR cluster and then create steps and run steps during the course of any point of time. But in case of transient EMR cluster, you launch EMR cluster, you also define a step at the same time. When you're configuring EMR cluster, in fact, you configure your step also at the same time, and then you start the cluster. So the cluster starts, then it runs the steps, and then it terminates itself. And the configuration wise, it's no different. Only difference is that in transient EMR, you need to have step also configured along with your EMR cluster configuration. And if it is not making much sense, guys, I mean, I have a lab towards the end, and then you can run that lab to understand how this whole configuration works. But let's try to understand what change of configuration goes if you're going for a transient EMR cluster. So when you're running a transient EMR cluster, in that case, you configure your cluster and your step together in one go, and you launch the cluster. Okay. So first thing you have to do, so most of the configuration you do in the steps section. So in the steps section, you have to say cluster should automatically terminate. So when the last step has been completed, so your cluster can have more than one step configured. And when the last step has completed, that means when all the jobs are completed, then the cluster should automatically terminate itself. Then you add steps. In fact, you can add more than step. I'm just showing you one sample step here, which is running a custom, which is running basically a Spark submit job command to run a Python job uploaded to an S3 bucket. And then when you do that, you can see here that your jobs, your step gets created. So you can see here, so you first set one last step completes, you automatically terminate. And then you can use this add step button to add as many steps as possible. So number of steps depends on how many jobs you want this cluster to complete before it terminates. And those steps are listed like here, like one I added here. So you can add more than one step. And this is only additional configuration you have to do if you're trying to configure a transient EMR cluster. Okay. And then when you start the job, when you stop the cluster actually, or you launch the cluster will launch. It will complete all the steps or the jobs which were submitted along with the cluster, and then it will automatically terminate. So if you look at the termination of transient cluster, you will see that like this was a transient cluster which was terminated after completing the job, auto terminated after completing the job. So you can see that it's saying that it's terminated after completing all the steps, and it shows that there's one step it has completed, and then it has automatically terminated. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Not that you have to do something very special, just a small configuration change, and you can launch your cluster as a transient cluster. So what we are going to do today is we're going to do a very small exercise to learn about transient EMR cluster. So we will have an source S3 bucket with some files into there, and then we'll launch a transient EMR cluster with one EMR step. So the cluster will start, it will complete the task or the job, and it will terminate itself. And then we'll see in the S3 bucket one output file as per the business logic defined into this step. So in order to complete this exercise, we have created an exercise and published to our website aws-dojo.com. The URL of the exercise is also provided in the description box below. Now I'm going to walk you through the steps of the exercise, and post that you can run this exercise by your own to get the experience of running transient EMR cluster. So let's jump to the exercise. So here is the exercise which is uploaded to our website aws-dojo.com. And these are the steps you need to perform. The first step is pretty straightforward. You need to have an AWS account in order to use this exercise. And if you don't have an AWS account, you might want to use this link to create the account. Then we create an S3 bucket. And in this S3 bucket, we create 3 buckets actually. One is input, output, and script. Input bucket is actually used to have the source file, the file which EMR cluster task will or step will process. The output is where that business logic or that job will write the output. And script is where we have stored the Python script for the EMR step or for the job. Okay, so we create these 3 folders, and then in the input folder you upload a sample data file customers.csv, and here is the link from where you can download this customers.csv file. So we simply upload customers.csv file to the input folder. Now we prepare a script for the EMR step. So this is the script we are going to use with the EMR step to process the job. It's pretty straightforward, guys, here in this case. So we are simply importing the PySpark SQL libraries. Then we start a Spark session. Then so we are passing 2 arguments here. One is the input location, input S3 bucket location using this argument 1. And the argument 2 is, sorry, there are 3 arguments here, but yeah, the argument 2 is your S3 bucket input location, and argument 3 is your argument 3 is actually your output location of the S3 bucket. So it uses 0 index, so it's a 0, 1, and 2, and the 0 or the first argument actually is the location of the Python file. Okay. So well, so without going into that part, so what you're doing over here is that it's using a Spark read operations to read from the input bucket and infer the schema, so it generates the schema. Then we are saying that, okay, let's out of this data frame, just select customer name and email. I don't want other fields, actually, other columns. And then we simply write it back to the S3 output location. And we convert from CSV to Parquet format. Very simple business logic, just to test it. So we save this script as a dojo emr task.python file and upload it to the script folder under this bucket. So my script is also ready. Now we can launch an EMR cluster in a transient mode. So we go to EMR management console and we click on create cluster. Then we go to the advanced option, and there I select the latest EMR release available at that point of time. And then since I'm using PySpark, so I need a Spark, Apache Spark environment to run that. So I'm selecting additional runtime requirement, a software configuration, that is your Spark 2.4.7. Then we go to the steps section where we convert this actually a normal cluster into a transient cluster, and here we are saying after the last step completes, cluster should automatically terminate, so become a transient cluster. And then we are configuring a step or a job, and in the step we simply select do a command runner. So basically we are saying is that, hey, run run Spark submit command, and then my first parameter is the location of the Python file. Second parameter is my input location, which is customers.csv location, and the second one is my output location. Okay, and if you remember, guys, if you go back to code again, you can see here, now you can see how the code is using actually second and third arguments to read the input location and output location. And after that, yeah, we simply add this task. You can add more than one task, but for this tutorial, we kept it simple and just one task. Then rest of the configuration goes like any normal EMR cluster you will configure. So you select your instance group profile, you select your network and subnets, you give a cluster a nice name. Then you also configure the roles for the, in this case, we are using a default role for the EMR cluster. And then simply we are keeping most of the configuration as a default, and then we're simply creating the cluster. When the cluster creates, so in a normal cluster, when you say I want to create a cluster will start and it goes to a wait state. That means it's waiting for a task or step to be submitted to it. But in this case, since it is a transient cluster, the cluster will start. It will see, okay, how many jobs I have, and it say, okay, I have got only one job. It will finish that job, and then it will automatically terminate itself. So you can see over here that your cluster is started, and then it automatically terminated. And if you go and see the details, you can see that this Dojo task we created to run that Python file to read data from the one S3 bucket folder to other S3 bucket folder, it has completed that task. In order to verify the outcome, you can go to the output folder and you can see there's a Parquet file created there by virtue of having this task. Okay, so you saw the examples that you launched an EMR cluster and then when EMR cluster run, it completed all the steps assigned to it, and then it finally auto terminate itself. Okay, and this was an example of transient EMR cluster. Now the next step is to clean up the resources so that you don't incur any cost post this exercise. So that was all for this exercise, guys. Hope you like the exercise, and if you like, please click on the like button and please subscribe to my channel. There are many other similar exercises and workshops which you can use to learn about AWS services. And these exercises and workshops are published to our website aws-dojo.com. So please do visit this website and use these exercises and these labs to learn about AWS services. We always look forward to your feedback for improvement, for the request for the new content, like this one was based on a request for a new content, or even if we commit some mistake, we like to hear from you. Many questions, many people ask follow-up questions about my tutorials, something to clarify, something to discuss, and I happily like to answer them. So if you have any such things, you can provide your feedback, comments, remarks, questions, either in the comment section of my YouTube channel, or you can also click on the Contact Us tab over here and can provide feedback. So we always look forward to your feedback. So that's all for today, guys. I promise to come back again in a week's time with another such tutorials. In the meantime, stay safe and have a nice day. Bye-bye.